According to a 2025 Goldman Sachs survey, households earning between $300,000 and $500,000 a year are more likely to say they're living paycheck to paycheck than households earning $50,000 to $100,000. Read that again. If a bigger income solved this problem, that sentence couldn't exist. It does. Somewhere between not enough money and plenty of money, something else entirely starts deciding whether a person is actually free, or just further into a trap they can't see the walls of yet. This isn't a documentary about people who make bad decisions. Almost none of the people in this story made one. It's a documentary about people who made reasonable decisions, one after another, inside a system engineered to keep the trap invisible until it's already closed around them. Backed by research out of Princeton, Yale, the Federal Reserve, and a century of economic history most people have never been taught. Not one of these traps requires a villain. That's what makes them harder to escape than the traps everyone already knows about, with obvious warning labels attached. These are quieter. They wear a suit. They arrive disguised as good news. By the end, the only real question left standing is the one you'll be asking about your own life, and whether you already know the answer. Ask yourself that question honestly for a second before we go any further. Not am I bad with money? Almost nobody watching this is bad with money in the way that phrase usually means. The real question is quieter than that. Which of these doors have you already walked through, so long ago and so reasonably that you stopped noticing it was a door at all? Start with the illusion sitting underneath that Goldman Sachs number, because it's stranger than it first looks. In the same survey, something almost nobody expected showed up in the middle of the income scale. Households earning $200,000 to $300,000 a year, comfortably upper middle class, nowhere near the very top, reported the lowest rate of paycheck-to-paycheck living of any group in the entire study. Not the highest earners. Not the lowest. A narrow band sitting in what researchers called a financial sweet spot, largely because that group hadn't yet been pulled into the spending expected at the tiers just above them, the country club, the larger house, the private school tuition that starts to feel less like a luxury and more like an obligation. Cross that line, and the paycheck-to-paycheck rate climbs right back up. Past $500,000 a year, roughly 2 in 5 households report the same financial anxiety as a family earning a fraction of that income. Read your own number against that scale for a second. Where do you actually land? Income, past a certain point, quietly stops being the variable that determines whether someone feels secure. Something else takes over the controls. Analysts call this the K-shaped economy, one branch of earners pulling steadily ahead, another branch, regardless of income bracket, sliding into what one recent report bluntly called a financial vortex, where housing, child care, and healthcare costs quietly absorb every dollar a raise was supposed to free up. Goldman Sachs's own researchers project that by 2033, more than half of all U.S. workers will be living paycheck to paycheck. Not because wages stopped rising, because the treadmill underneath them has been rising just as fast, in a currency most people never learn to measure. Picture the version of this that never makes it into a survey. A nice house. A driveway that looks like proof someone made it. And behind the front door, after the kids are asleep, a quiet conversation about which card to use this month, and whether an emergency this week would actually be a problem. From the street, nothing about that house looks like a trap. That's the entire design. An invisible trap only stays invisible from the outside. That's the first door. There are more waiting behind it, and by the time this is over, you'll probably recognize which ones you've personally already walked through. Economists have spent over a decade fighting about exactly what that hidden currency actually is. In 2010, Princeton's Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton analyzed 450,000 Gallup responses and found that day-to-day emotional well-being rises with income only up to about $75,000 a year. Beyond that threshold, life looked better on paper, but stopped feeling meaningfully better, hour to hour. It became one of the most cited findings in behavioral economics. Then, in 2021, University of Pennsylvania researcher Matthew Killingsworth ran a sharper version of the same study, tracking mood in real time instead of relying on memory, and found no plateau at all. Well-being just kept climbing. Two Nobel-level researchers. Two opposite answers to the single most basic financial question there is. In 2023, Kahneman did something rare. He sat down with the man who'd challenged him, and together they found something stranger than either original study. For most people, well-being does keep rising with income, as Killingsworth found. But for one unhappy minority, it plateaus exactly as Kahneman first found, because whatever was draining them was never a number to begin with. If a Nobel laureate had to publicly revise his own famous finding, it's worth asking what the rest of us are still quietly getting wrong. That's the second door, the quiet assumption that the next raise will finally be the one that fixes everything. That assumption has a body count, and it's sitting in America's wallets right now, accumulating interest. As of the first quarter of 2026, total U.S. household debt reached an all-time high of $18.8 trillion, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Credit card balances alone stood at $1.25 trillion, and roughly 60% of cardholders carry a balance month to month, paying an average rate north of 20% to do it. At that rate, the minimum payment on an average balance doesn't take months to clear. It takes decades, and costs more than double what was originally borrowed. The burden isn't landing evenly, either. Delinquencies are concentrated hardest in lower-income households even as overall spending, propped up by higher earners, looks perfectly healthy from a distance. Nobody sits down and plans 18 years of debt. Present bias sees to that, the well-documented tendency to feel the sting of paying later far less sharply than the sting of paying now, even when later comes wearing 20% interest and a due date that keeps arriving. Every individual swipe is a rational feeling decision, made by a reasonable person solving a today-sized problem. The 18 years is simply the invisible sum of every one of those individually reasonable decisions, stacked without anyone ever adding them up out loud. That balance was never really charging a card. It was charging time, years of it, quietly billed to a future that hadn't happened yet. Picture the drawer almost every household has somewhere, the one nobody opens on purpose. A handful of statements, unopened or barely skimmed, each one individually forgettable. Nobody ever decided, in one sitting, to owe 18 years of payments. They decided, on a Tuesday, that one dinner out was fine. Then again, on a different Tuesday, that it was fine again. The drawer doesn't announce what it's become. It just quietly gets heavier, one unremarkable Tuesday at a time, until the day someone finally adds it all up out loud. But debt isn't the only cost hiding behind a decision that felt small in the moment. Sometimes the cost isn't even what you paid. It's what you never stopped to consider giving up in exchange. In 2009, researchers at Yale and Singapore Management University ran an experiment built around a single reframed sentence. A customer stood frozen in an electronics store, paralyzed between a $1,000 stereo and a $700 one, unable to decide, until a salesman stepped in and reframed the choice out loud. Would he rather have the more expensive stereo, or the cheaper one plus $300 worth of music to go with it? The decision that had felt genuinely difficult seconds earlier dissolved almost instantly. The cheaper stereo won without hesitation. Nothing about either product had changed in that moment. The only thing that changed was that the alternative finally became visible, spoken out loud instead of sitting silently in the background where it's usually ignored. The researchers called this opportunity cost neglect, and their broader findings confirmed exactly what that stereo showdown suggested. Left to their own devices, most people simply don't generate the mental list of what a purchase is quietly displacing. Not because they're careless or unintelligent. Because the brain treats, what else could this become as extra cognitive work nobody asked it to do, work it will happily skip, right up until someone forces the comparison into the room out loud. Every dollar spent has a next best use working silently in the background, whether or not anyone acknowledges it. Most people never hear the salesman's sentence. They just take the more expensive stereo home, quietly convinced they made a straightforward choice, never once running the comparison that would have changed their mind. Scale that same blind spot up from a stereo to a car, a renovation, a wedding, and the comparison being skipped isn't $300 of music anymore. It's a year of an index fund quietly compounding, or a decade shaved off a mortgage. Nobody hands most people that alternative out loud at the counter. So most people never take it. By now, you've probably already recognized at least one of these doors, maybe two. Good. Hold on to that. We're only halfway through, and the next ones hit differently. And even the dollars that do make it safely into savings aren't protected from a trap most people never think to check for, because this one doesn't take money away from you directly. It just quietly, patiently changes what the money is actually worth while the number on the screen stays exactly the same. In 1928, the economist Irving Fisher published a book built around a story he witnessed firsthand in post-war Germany, where the currency had lost roughly 98% of its value in a matter of years. A shopkeeper sold Fisher a shirt at what looked, on paper, like a generous markup over what she'd originally paid for it, and told him, entirely sincerely, that she'd made a healthy profit on the sale. She hadn't. Replacing that exact shirt would cost her every bit as much as she'd just charged him, because the number printed on the currency had detached completely from what it could actually purchase. She wasn't lying to him. She genuinely couldn't see it, because nothing about the bills in her hand looked any different than they always had. Fisher named the blind spot money illusion, the tendency to judge wealth by the number printed on it, rather than by what that number is actually able to buy. It isn't only a post-war Germany problem, and it isn't only a hyperinflation problem. Throughout the entire decade of the 1970s, the Dow Jones Industrial Average barely moved, while prices in the broader economy roughly doubled. On paper, a portfolio holder's account balance looked essentially unchanged, year after year, a decade of apparent stability. In reality, they had quietly lost close to half their purchasing power without a single stock ever being sold. Economists later nicknamed it the silent crash, because absolutely nothing about it resembled a crash while it was actually happening. The nominal number held perfectly steady the entire time. Only the real one, the one that actually mattered, was collapsing underneath it. The same blind spot is running today. Consumer prices are climbing at close to the fastest pace in 3 years, driven partly by a sharp rise at the gas pump, the kind of increase that shows up instantly in a paycheck comparison and just as instantly disappears from the math the moment the paycheck itself goes up. The number on the pay stub feels like progress. Whether it actually is depends on a subtraction almost nobody performs. That's 5 traps down, and every one of them has been about real money, money that genuinely existed, just misread, mismanaged, or misunderstood along the way. The 6th trap doesn't even require real money to spring shut. It only requires an audience willing to watch. In 1899, the economist Thorstein Veblen studied a category of purchases that broke classical economic theory in half. Normally, demand falls as price rises. That's the entire foundation of a supply and demand curve. But for a certain class of goods, what Veblen called conspicuous consumption, demand rises alongside the price, because the price was never really the cost to be minimized. The price is the message. A watch that costs 10 times more than an identical-looking alternative isn't valued despite that markup. It's valued because of it, because the number itself is precisely what gets communicated to everyone standing close enough to notice. Economists still call these Veblen goods today, and the uncomfortable part of his finding was never that people enjoy nice things. It's that the entire value of certain purchases lives entirely inside what other people believe they cost. Which means the moment nobody's watching, the value evaporates completely. You cannot wear a status symbol into an empty room and feel anything from it at all. In 1996, one of the biggest entertainers on the planet filed for bankruptcy after earning an estimated $70 million in a handful of years. Stanley Burrell, the world knew him as MC Hammer, spent $12 million on a mansion, then poured another $30 million into renovating it, gold-plated gates spelling out Hammer Time, a bowling alley, 2 swimming pools, marble statues of himself, a staff of 200 people costing up to $1 million a month. When the music stopped selling, the mansion didn't get smaller and the staff didn't get shorter. He filed for bankruptcy roughly $13 million in debt, against only a fraction of that in assets. He didn't really build a mansion. He built proof, and then had to keep paying 200 people just to keep an audience in the room to witness it. Picture the watch coming off at night, set down on a nightstand in an empty bedroom, worth in that moment exactly as much as a $50 one from a drugstore rack. The value was never inside the object. It was rented, by the hour, from an audience that has to physically show up to collect. More than a century after Veblen wrote it down, entire industries still run on exactly this mechanism: luxury goods, exclusive memberships, anything designed to be recognized before it's actually used. The price isn't a flaw in the marketing. In a Veblen good, the price is the marketing. 6 traps in, every single one of them survives by feeling completely reasonable while it's actually happening. Nobody signs up to lose 18 years to interest, or half their purchasing power to a currency that never moved, or the value of a purchase to an empty room. They just make one small, ordinary decision, and then another one very much like it. Which brings us to the 7th trap, the one that doesn't just feel reasonable. It feels like the finish line itself. Behavioral economists have a name for the psychological force running underneath it, the endowment effect, a bias first demonstrated experimentally by Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler, who found that people consistently demand far more to give up an object they already own than they'd ever pay to acquire that exact same object in the first place. In their original experiments, participants were handed an ordinary coffee mug and asked what price would convince them to sell it. Others, holding no mug at all, were asked what they'd pay to buy the identical one. Sellers, on average, wanted roughly double what buyers were willing to offer for the exact same mug. Ownership alone, held for a few minutes, was enough to double its perceived worth. Now picture someone sitting in a parking garage after 6 o'clock, engine off, a resignation letter open on their phone, unsent for the 3rd year running. They're not underpaid. They're not miserable, exactly. They're just holding a mug they were handed years ago, and it has started to feel like it would cost more to put down than it was ever worth to keep. Now stretch that same effect out over years instead of minutes. Stock options that haven't fully vested yet. Seniority that took a decade of quiet loyalty to build. A pension that only pays out in full if you stay until the end. None of it is inherently a trap on its own. But once someone has sunk years into a compensation structure specifically designed to reward staying, walking away doesn't just mean forfeiting the new opportunity. It means the brain treats the years already invested in the old one as though they were still spendable, still recoverable, still worth protecting at any cost. Companies didn't invent this particular piece of human psychology. They simply learned, with remarkable precision, exactly which bias to build the golden cage out of, and unlike a real cage, this one never needs a lock. The door stays open the entire time. Almost nobody ever tests whether it actually is. And this is the trap that makes every other one worse. The income that felt safe enough to spend a little more of it came from here. The years traded for a pension that vests on someone else's schedule, also here. 6 traps that feel ordinary on their own become nearly impossible to walk away from once the 7th one is the thing quietly paying for all 6. 7 traps. And here's what none of them share on the surface, but every one of them shares underneath, quietly, in the exact same way. Not one of them required a single bad decision to spring. Every trap here ran on a decision that felt completely rational at the precise moment it was made. Spend the raise the way everyone around you spends theirs, carry the balance because next month feels manageable, skip the mental comparison because naming it takes effort, trust the number on the statement because it's the only number you were shown, buy the visible thing because invisible wealth convinces no one, stay one more year because leaving means giving something up that feels irreplaceable. The trap was never any single decision. It was that nobody ever built a moment to notice the decision happening in real time. That's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, more than any individual statistic in this documentary. Not that these 7 traps exist somewhere out in the economy, in a Federal Reserve report or a Yale study. That you have almost certainly already shaken hands with at least one of them, dressed up as something completely ordinary, a raise, a balance, a watch, a stereo, a stock grant, without a single person ever pausing long enough to tell you its actual name. Somewhere right now, a household earning $400,000 a year is quietly panicking over a bill it can't entirely explain. And somewhere else tonight, in a smaller house, with a smaller number arriving every other Friday, a household earning a third of that isn't panicking at all. Both went to work today. Both will go again tomorrow. From the street, there is no way to tell which one is free. There never is. That's not an accident. That's the design. The wealth trap was never a lack of money. It was never being told, at the right moment, by anyone, that the door already had a name. Nobody was going to tell you that tonight, either. Somebody just did.